You're at dinner. Everyone's talking. Someone's telling a story about their weekend. Someone else is laughing at something that isn't that funny. And you're right there, physically present but somewhere else entirely. Not because you're bored or you don't care, but your mind is already 3 layers deeper than the conversation allows. You've noticed the way someone's smile doesn't quite reach their eyes. You've felt the tension underneath the laughter. You've already traced the conversation back to its unspoken cause while everyone else is still on the surface. And you want to say something real, honest, something that actually matters. But you've done that before, and you know what happens. The room shifts, someone clears their throat, the moment disappears, and you go quiet again. If that sounds like your life, then this video was made for you, because that experience has a scientific explanation, and it's not a flaw. It never was. Most people use the term deep thinker like it's a personality type, an identity, something you either are or you aren't. But neuroscience tells a more specific story. Inside your brain, there is a network of regions that activates when you're not focused on the outside world, when you're reflecting, imagining, processing meaning. Scientists call it the default mode network, discovered by neurologist Marcus Raschel. And for most people, it quiets down when they engage with the world around them. But for deep thinkers, it doesn't. A 2025 review published in Current Opinion in Behavioral Sciences described the DMN as potentially the core of consciousness itself, the network responsible for self-reflection, emotional processing, social understanding, and the construction of meaning. For most people, this network has an off switch. For deep thinkers, it runs continuously. And here is what that actually means in your daily life. You don't just experience a moment. You process it, you dissect it, you search for what it means long after it's over. Someone says something offhand in a conversation. Everyone else moves on, but you're still there 3 hours later, turning the words over. Not because something is wrong with you, but because your brain is wired to extract meaning from everything it encounters. You were not built for surfaces. You were built for depth. And in a world that mostly lives on the surface, that comes at a cost. Here's something that will resonate immediately if you've spent your life thinking deeply. You can read a room before anyone speaks. You sense the tension underneath the laughter. You notice what isn't said more clearly than what is. And you've probably been told your whole life that you're too sensitive, too intense, that you overthink everything, but you weren't overthinking. You were seeing. Dr. Elaine Aron's research on highly sensitive people found that approximately 20% of the population processes sensory and emotional information at a fundamentally deeper level than everyone else. Their nervous systems are literally wired differently. They notice more. They feel more. They connect more dots. And here is the part that matters. This is not anxiety and not a disorder. This is a neurological trait that in the right environment is one of the most powerful things a human mind can do. The problem is the environment. Think about your childhood. If you grew up somewhere unpredictable, where moods shifted without warning, where love sometimes felt conditional, where you learned to read the room just to feel safe, then your brain did something remarkable. It tuned itself even more finely. It became even more sensitive to subtle shifts in tone, expression, energy, because in that environment, awareness meant safety. And that same awareness that once protected you is still running now in every room you walk into, every conversation you have, every relationship you build. You didn't choose this. You were shaped by it. And the mind that once saved you is now the mind you're trying to understand. There is a specific experience that deep thinkers know better than almost anyone. You replay a conversation from 3 days ago and find something you missed. You trace a feeling back through 6 layers until you find its original source. You lie awake at night, not because you're anxious, but because your mind found something interesting, and it will not let go. until it understands it completely. Psychology calls this rumination, but that word doesn't quite capture it, because for deep thinkers, it's not always painful. Sometimes it's almost compulsive, a kind of hunger. The DMN, that default mode network, releases a subtle reward signal every time it connects two pieces of meaning. Every time an insight forms, every time a pattern becomes clear, your brain is literally rewarding you for going deeper. But here is the danger that researchers have identified. The brain cannot tell the difference between an insight that leads somewhere and an insight that leads to another question, that leads to another question, that leads nowhere. So you can spend hours, sometimes years, dissecting your own thoughts with stunning precision and still feel like you haven't moved, because thinking about your life is not the same as living it. And for deep thinkers, this is perhaps the most honest and painful truth there is. The same mind that sees everything clearly can become a closed loop, seeing, analyzing, understanding, but never quite arriving. Carl Jung understood this, and he wrote something that cuts straight through. A person who thinks all the time has nothing to think about except thoughts. So he loses touch with reality and lives in a world of illusions. That's not a criticism. That's a warning from someone who loved the inner world but understood its dangers intimately. You felt it. That specific moment when you say something real and the room goes quiet, not because what you said was wrong, but because it was too true, too specific, too far beneath the surface that everyone else was comfortable staying on. Jung called it the encounter with the shadow, the moment when depth reveals what comfort has been hiding. And most people, when they encounter that, don't lean in, they pull back. And so deep thinkers learn, slowly, painfully. They learn to hold back, to soften their words, to read the room before speaking, to ask themselves, is this the kind of conversation this person can actually have before opening the door? Jung wrote, "Loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." And that is the specific loneliness of a deep thinker, not the loneliness of having no one around, the loneliness of being surrounded by people and still feeling like no one speaks your language. You are not broken. You're not too much. You are operating at a frequency that most people were never taught to tune into. And in a world that rewards speed, certainty, and surface, depth can feel like a disability when it is actually the rarest kind of intelligence there is. This is the part most people have never heard. Deep thinking is not just a personality trait, it is often a response. A 2024 review published in Frontiers in Behavioral Neuroscience found that early adversity, unpredictability, emotional inconsistency, environments where you had to read people carefully just to feel safe, fundamentally shapes the default mode network. In other words, the child who grew up scanning the room for subtle signals developed a brain that never stopped scanning. Think about that. The thing you've sometimes seen as a burden, the way your mind never quiets, the way you feel things others don't seem to feel, the way you see through things before anyone else does, that started as protection. Your mind learned to go deep because going deep meant staying safe. You didn't choose this way of experiencing the world. It was built into you by a world that required it. And that changes everything about how you see yourself. Because if deep thinking was your brain's response to an environment that demanded awareness, then it was never a flaw. It was intelligence applied to survival. The question now is, what do you do with that intelligence when the environment is no longer the same? Let me be careful here, because this is not about fixing yourself. You are not broken. This is about learning to carry the mind you have in a way that doesn't exhaust you. The first thing that actually helps, and this comes directly from the neuroscience, is learning the difference between reflection and rumination. Reflection moves towards something. It asks a question and follows it somewhere useful. Rumination loops. It asks the same question from 17 different angles and never finds a door. When you notice your mind looping, returning to the same thought for the 5th time, that is not depth. That is the DMN chasing a reward it cannot find. The practical shift is simple, but not easy. Ask yourself, is this thought taking me somewhere or keeping me in place? If it's keeping you in place, write it down, put it somewhere external. Your brain is searching for resolution. Writing gives it one, not because the writing solves anything, but because the act of externalizing the thought signals to your nervous system. I have seen this. I have recorded it. I can let it rest now. The second thing that helps, and Jung would agree with this completely, is contact with the world as it actually is, not as you've analyzed it, as it is. Deep thinkers are often most alive in moments of complete absorption, a project that demands full attention, a conversation that goes somewhere real, a physical experience that pulls them entirely into the present. Research published in Frontiers in Behavioral Neuroscience found that flow states, moments of complete immersion, involve dynamic interactions between the default mode network and the executive control network, creating a state where the analytical mind and the experiencing mind work together instead of against each other. Flow is not the absence of thought. It is thought in service of experience. And for deep thinkers who have spent so much time thinking about experience, learning to think within experience is perhaps the most important shift there is. The third thing, and this is the most honest thing I can say, is to stop apologizing for your mind. Not to everyone, not in every room, but to yourself. Jung believed that the path to wholeness was not the elimination of your depth, but its integration. Learning to carry your awareness without being consumed by it. Learning to see clearly without losing the ability to be present. Learning to think deeply without mistaking thinking for living. There's a reason you've always felt slightly out of sync with the speed of the world around you. Not because you're broken or because you're wrong, but because your mind moves at the pace of meaning, and meaning takes time. The world will not always wait for you. Some people won't know how to meet you where you are. Some conversations will never go deep enough. Some rooms will always shift when you say something true. That's not a reason to go quiet. Jung wrote, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." You've been awake for a long time, and waking up is not comfortable, but it is the most honest way anyone has ever lived. Your mind was never the problem. It was always the answer to a world that asked too much of you too early. If you want to understand more about yourself and others, watch this video. I tried to explain the science behind self-sabotage and how to overcome it.